Everyone in the underground knew one rule about Holden Cross's fortress: stay away from the eastern courtyard after dark. The massive cane corso that prowled those grounds had sent 3 intruders to the hospital and turned 2 experienced dog handlers into quivering wrecks who refused to speak about what they'd witnessed. Phantom wasn't just a guard dog. He was a 130-pound embodiment of controlled violence, black as midnight with amber eyes that tracked movement like a predator calculating kill trajectories. The security team maintaining Cross's 18-acre compound had learned to give the beast a 20-foot radius at all times. Steel chains meant to restrain him lay in twisted fragments across the courtyard stones, snapped like holiday ribbon during one of his territorial displays. Concrete feeding bowls built to withstand industrial abuse had been shattered by jaws that could generate over 700 pounds of pressure per square inch. Even the mansion's most hardened enforcers, men who'd committed acts that haunted lesser souls, crossed themselves when walking past the courtyard's iron gates. Holden Cross had hand-selected Phantom from an Italian breeder specializing in protection animals for high-value clients who operated outside legal boundaries. The dog arrived at 6 months old, already displaying the territorial aggression and unwavering loyalty that made Concorsos legendary. 2 years of intensive training by a former military handler had refined Phantom's instincts into something approaching supernatural awareness. The dog could detect intruders before electronic surveillance picked up their heat signatures, his behavioral responses calibrated to eliminate threats with mechanical efficiency. The crime lord controlled operations spanning 3 states, his influence reaching into city council chambers and federal courtrooms with equal effectiveness. Politicians returned his calls within minutes, and rival organizations had learned through painful experience that crossing Cross meant consequences that extended across generations. Yet for all his power over human affairs, Holden maintained a peculiar respect for Phantom's dominion. The eastern courtyard belonged entirely to the dog, and even its owner approached with careful deliberation and specific commands. On this particular winter evening, temperatures dropped toward freezing, and security protocols ran on heightened alert due to recent territorial disputes with competing organizations. The delivery entrance on the compound's southern perimeter had a gap barely wide enough for a grown man's arm to pass through. A defect scheduled for repair had been deprioritized amid more pressing security concerns. What slipped through that gap at 7:43 p.m. was something far smaller and infinitely more unexpected. Security cameras captured the thermal signature first, a small form moving with purpose rather than the erratic patterns of wildlife. The guard monitoring feeds in the second-floor security hub initially dismissed it as a neighborhood cat, until the figure emerged into floodlight illumination. What appeared on his screens made him reach for the emergency alert button with hands that suddenly wouldn't cooperate properly. A child, no more than 7 years old, walked across the frosted lawn with directional certainty of someone following a map only she could see. Her coat was 3 sizes too large, held closed with duct tape where buttons should have been. Her shoes left mismatched prints suggesting they'd been salvaged from different sources. The guard's spine turned to ice as he registered her trajectory, a straight line toward the eastern courtyard. Phantom's growl resonated through the mansion's stone foundation, a sound that registered below conscious hearing, but triggered primal responses in everyone within range. Guards who'd served in combat zones felt their adrenal systems spike, hands moving toward weapons they knew would be useless. The girl showed no awareness of her danger, no hesitation in her steady approach toward gates that separated manicured lawn from courtyard's deliberately sparse terrain. Holden Cross was reviewing financial reports in his second-floor office when his head of security burst through the door without knocking. The man's face had gone pale beneath his permanent tan, and he was already pulling up security feed on the tablet he thrust toward his employer. Cross took the device, his expression shifting from irritation to sharp focus as he registered what was unfolding in real time on his property. The crime lord moved with controlled speed that belied his tailored suit and polished appearance, taking stairs 2 at a time while maintaining predatory grace. His mind raced through scenarios and countermeasures, calculating responses to threats he couldn't yet define. But when he burst through the mansion's rear entrance into the frigid evening air, all his strategic planning evaporated. Phantom stood in the courtyard's center, every muscle in his powerful frame coiled with aggressive intent, teeth exposed in a display that would have sent wolves retreating. The cane corso's hackles were raised to maximum extension, making his already imposing size appear even more formidable. That low, continuous growl had escalated to something approaching a roar. 4 guards flanked Holden, weapons drawn despite knowing bullets would likely reach the child before stopping the dog. The The girl had somehow entered the courtyard proper, though the gate remained closed, a mystery for later investigation if anyone survived to conduct it. She stood 15 feet from Phantom, directly in his kill zone, with no barrier between fragile human flesh and unleashed canine aggression. Her small hands hung at her sides, not raised in surrender or defense. Her face held an expression Holden couldn't immediately categorize, something beyond fear or foolishness. For 3 suspended heartbeats, the tableau held, child and beast locked in confrontation, that physics and common sense dictated, could have only one outcome. Guards held their breath, weapons trained but useless, while Holden felt something unfamiliar clawing at his chest. Genuine helplessness. The evening air seemed to press down with physical weight, winter's cold forgotten in the heat of absolute focus on those 15 feet. Then the girl's lips moved, and a single word cut through Phantom's growling with the precision of a surgical blade through tissue. The word was too soft for observers to distinguish, meant only for the dog's ears, but its effect was instantaneous and absolute. Phantom's entire body language transformed as if someone had thrown a switch in his neural wiring. The aggressive stance collapsed, muscles releasing tension. The 130-pound cane Corso dropped to his belly with shocking speed, powerful legs folding beneath him as he crawled forward like a supplicant approaching sacred ground. Holden watched in stunned disbelief as his supposedly untouchable guard dog placed his massive head beneath the child's tiny hand. Amber eyes closed with something that looked disturbingly like relief, like recognition of someone he'd been waiting for. The girl's fingers disappeared into Phantom's black fur. The guards remained frozen, weapons still trained on a threat that had somehow transmuted into impossibility before their eyes. Holden felt his tactical mind struggling to process what 2 years of expensive training and carefully cultivated aggression had been undone by a single word. The silence that followed Phantom's transformation was somehow more oppressive than his earlier growling, filled with questions that demanded answers none of them possessed. Holden approached slowly, each step measured and deliberate, acutely aware that he was entering territory where his authority meant nothing compared to whatever connection had just manifested. Phantom's eyes opened as his master drew near, but the caney Corso made no move to leave the child's side. The dog positioned his bulk as a barrier between her and all others, a protective stance that spoke of instincts deeper than training. The girl's eyes met Holden's across the remaining distance, and the crime lord found himself cataloging details with analytical precision he applied to evaluating threats. She couldn't weigh more than 40 pounds soaking wet, malnutrition evident in the hollow spaces beneath her cheekbones. Her wrists appeared too fragile to support even her diminished body weight. But those eyes held something that transcended physical vulnerability, a depth of experience that shouldn't exist in someone so young. Her lips were chapped and bleeding at the corners, evidence of exposure to elements without adequate protection or nutrition to maintain basic cellular repair. The coat engulfing her small frame bore stains that told stories of sleeping in places no child should know existed. Her hair hung in matted tangles that suggested weeks without access to basic hygiene facilities. Yet she stood with Phantom's head under her hand as if she'd been born to command respect from creatures designed to inspire terror. Holden stopped 10 feet away, maintaining distance that wouldn't trigger protective responses from the dog who'd apparently assigned himself new duties without consulting his legal owner. His security team had fanned out in a loose semicircle, weapons lowered but ready, their training warring with the evidence before them. The crime lord's mind worked through possibilities, discarding explanations that didn't account for the absolute nature of the transformation he'd witnessed. "What's your name?" Holden asked, his voice carefully modulated to project authority without aggression, the tone he used when negotiating with parties who held unexpected leverage. The girl's gaze didn't waver, didn't show the fear or calculation he'd learned to recognize in people who found themselves unexpectedly in his presence. She simply looked at him with those ancient eyes, one hand still buried in Phantom's fur, while the other hung loosely at her side. Several seconds passed without response, and Holden felt the weight of his security team's attention, their silent questions about how to proceed when standard protocols had been shattered. Phantom remained motionless, except for the steady rise and fall of his breathing, completely relaxed in a way the crime lord had never witnessed. The courtyard's floodlights cast harsh shadows across the scene, turning it into something from a fever dream where logic had taken temporary leave. "How did you get onto my property?" Holden tried again, rephrasing his approach when the first question yielded only silence. The girl's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something that suggested she found his confusion almost understandable, given his limited perspective. Her free hand moved to join the first in Phantom's fur, and the dog's eyes closed again. A rumble of contentment emerged from his chest that sounded nothing like his earlier territorial warnings. One of the guards shifted his weight, a nearly imperceptible movement that nonetheless drew Phantom's immediate attention. The amber eyes snapped open, fixing on the guard with intensity that froze the man mid-motion. But the aggression that should have accompanied that focus was absent, replaced by something more akin to protective assessment. The message was clear. The girl was under Phantom's protection, and any perceived threat would be evaluated through that lens. Holden raised his hand, signaling his team to maintain absolute stillness, his tactical mind recognizing that they'd entered a situation where traditional power dynamics had been suspended. The girl watched this exchange with apparent interest, but no fear, as if she'd expected exactly this response and found it merely confirmatory. Her small chest rose and fell with steady breaths that showed none of the rapid-fire panic respiration that should accompany a 7-year-old. "Keva," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the courtyard's acoustics, designed to amplify sound for security purposes. The single word hung in the frozen air, a name that meant nothing to Holden, but apparently meant everything to Phantom. The dog's tail began moving in slow sweeps across the courtyard's stone surface, a gesture of recognition that the crime lord had only seen displayed in his own presence. Holden processed this new information, adding it to the growing list of impossibilities that had accumulated in the past 5 minutes. The name wasn't common, carried ethnic origins he couldn't immediately place, and did nothing to explain how this malnourished child had waltzed through his security perimeter. More importantly, it didn't explain why Phantom had responded to her with instant submission that contradicted every behavioral pattern established over 2 years. "Kiva," Holden repeated, testing the name on his own tongue, watching for any additional reaction from either girl or dog. Phantom's ears swiveled toward the sound, but the beast made no move, remaining in his protective position with the contentment of someone who'd found something long lost. The girl's expression didn't change, didn't acknowledge the repetition as anything significant. She simply continued stroking Phantom's fur, with movements that suggested deep familiarity. The crime lord's analytical mind cataloged the physical evidence before him. The girl's extreme malnutrition suggested months on the streets, yet her clothes, while filthy, weren't torn or shredded by extended exposure. Her hands, now visible in the floodlights, showed calluses consistent with manual labor or survival activities, but her nails, though dirty, weren't broken or damaged. She'd been living rough, but not for so long that irreversible damage had set in. The timeline mattered, though he couldn't yet articulate why. "When did you last eat?" Holden asked, shifting his tactical approach from interrogation to assessment, recognizing that the girl represented a puzzle that required different tools than he typically employed. Kiva's eyes flickered briefly toward the mansion's lit windows, a glance so quick he almost missed it. Then her attention returned to Phantom, her small fingers tracing patterns in the dog's fur that seemed to follow some internal logic only she understood. "Yesterday," she said, the word emerging with the same soft clarity as her name, but this time accompanied by information that triggered Holden's protective instincts in ways he hadn't anticipated. Yesterday meant she'd gone over 24 hours without food, while navigating a city whose winter temperatures could kill the unprepared. The fact that she'd somehow traveled to his compound, breached his security, and maintained enough presence of mind to approach Phantom spoke to survival skills far beyond her apparent age. Holden made a decision that surprised him, even as he vocalized it, turning to his head of security with instructions that would have seemed impossible 5 minutes earlier. "Get Dr. DuPont here now. Tell her it's urgent, but not an emergency with Phantom. There's a child who needs medical evaluation." The guard hesitated, years of training warring with the unprecedented nature of the situation. But Holden's expression brooked no argument, and the man pulled out his phone. Kiva watched this exchange with the same calm assessment, her hands never stopping their movement through Phantom's fur, the connection between girl and dog so absolute it seemed to exist outside normal physical laws. The crime lord found himself wondering what word she'd spoken, what single syllable had contained enough meaning to override months of conditioning. More importantly, he wondered how a 7-year-old homeless child knew it when even he, Phantom's owner, had never discovered such a key. "Doctor." Celeste Dupont arrived within 20 minutes, her silver Mercedes navigating the compound's security protocols with the ease of someone who'd made this journey dozens of times before. She emerged from the vehicle wearing casual evening clothes that suggested she'd been called away from personal time, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The French-Canadian veterinarian had treated Phantom since the dog's arrival from Italy, establishing professional boundaries with Holden that never quite masked her disapproval of his occupation. Celeste's stride across the lawn toward the courtyard carried the confidence of someone who'd faced down aggressive animals in far more precarious circumstances than manicured criminal estates. But her steps faltered when she registered the scene before her, Phantom lying in complete submission beneath a child's hand, Holden and his armed guards maintaining cautious distance. Her professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing genuine shock before training reasserted itself, and she moved forward with renewed purpose. "Mr. Cross, your man said there was a child needing medical attention, but he failed to mention she'd apparently domesticated your attack dog," Celeste said, her accent thickening slightly as it always did when she encountered situations outside her prepared protocols. She approached Keva with the same careful deliberation Holden had employed, but her focus was purely clinical, assessing the girl's physical condition, with eyes trained to spot distress signals in creatures who couldn't vocalize pain. Keva looked up at Celeste's approach, and something shifted in her expression that Holden couldn't quite interpret. Not fear, but perhaps wariness mixed with hope. The look of someone who'd learned that adults rarely meant safety, but occasionally represented resources. Phantom's eyes tracked the veterinarian's movement, but the dog remained relaxed, apparently having decided that anyone approaching slowly and without aggression posed no threat. Celeste knelt 6 feet from girl and beast, maintaining professional distance while her trained gaze catalogued damage. "My name is Dr. Dupont, but you can call me Celeste if that's easier," the veterinarian said, her voice dropping to the gentle register she used with frightened animals, apparently deciding that the same approach might work with traumatized children. "I'm a doctor for animals, which means I'm very good at noticing when someone isn't feeling well. Would you mind if I came a bit closer to make sure you're okay?" Keva's response was to look down at Phantom, as if consulting with the dog about whether this new arrival could be trusted. A gesture so natural, it suggested deep familiarity with using animal instincts as guidance systems. The cane corso's tail swept once across the stone, apparently communicating approval, and Keva's small head nodded. Celeste moved forward those final feet, her movements smooth and non-threatening, until she was close enough to begin proper assessment without touch. "When did you last have something to drink?" Celeste asked, noting the extreme chapping of Keva's lips and the slight sunken quality around her eyes that indicated dehydration. The girl's answer was immediate this time, as if the veterinarian's presence had somehow made communication easier than it had been with Holden. "This morning, from the fountain at the park." The specificity of the response told Celeste that Keva had been living rough long enough to develop routines around public water sources. The veterinarian's hand moved slowly toward Keva's wrist, telegraphing her intention to check pulse and temperature through touch, giving the girl time to refuse if needed. Keva didn't pull away, but Phantom's eyes opened to track the contact with protective vigilance that suggested his submission extended only to Keva herself. Celeste's fingers found the pulse point, counting beats that came too fast, feeling skin that burned with the dry heat of fever from prolonged exposure and insufficient nutrition. "She's running a temperature and showing signs of advanced malnutrition," Celeste said, directing her words toward Holden while keeping her attention on Keva, her clinical assessment overriding whatever personal feelings she held about the crime lord. "She needs immediate medical attention, proper hospital care, not field treatment. I can call an ambulance, but given your situation, I'm assuming you'd prefer private arrangements." The subtle emphasis on situation carried layers of meaning about Holden's complicated relationship with official channels. Holden felt the weight of decisions cascading through his mind, each option carrying consequences he couldn't fully calculate in the moment. Hospitals meant questions, documentation, potential involvement of child services that would remove Keva from his property before he understood what she represented. But private medical care meant bringing more people into his compound, expanding the circle of knowledge about tonight's impossible events. Phantom solved the dilemma by raising his massive head and looking directly at his owner, with what could only be described as expectation. "Bring her inside," Holden heard himself say. The words emerging before his tactical mind had finished weighing options, driven by some instinct he didn't fully trust but couldn't ignore. "Set up the guest suite on the second floor as a medical room. Contact Dr. Morrison. Tell him I need a house call and I'm paying double his usual rate for discretion. His security team moved immediately to implement these orders, years of training allowing them to accept unprecedented commands without visible hesitation. Celeste's expression shifted from professional assessment to something more complex, surprise mixed with what might have been approval, though she covered it quickly with renewed focus on Kiva. "Can you walk, sweetheart? Or would you like Mr. Cross's men to help you inside where it's warm?" she asked, giving the girl agency even in her diminished state. Kiva's answer was to look at Phantom again, that same consulting gesture, and the dog rose to his feet with fluid grace. The cane corso positioned himself against Kiva's side, offering his bulk as support, and the girl's small hand gripped his collar as she stood on legs that trembled with effort. Phantom moved forward at a pace that accommodated her weakness, becoming a living crutch that bore most of her weight without complaint. Holden watched this coordination between girl and beast, seeing patterns of prior familiarity that couldn't be explained by their brief courtyard encounter. The procession toward the mansion's entrance took on surreal quality. The homeless child supported by a dog trained to kill, followed by a disapproving veterinarian and a crime lord whose carefully constructed world had been upended by a single whispered word. Guards parted to create a clear path, their weapons holstered now, faces reflecting the same confusion and wonder that Holden felt churning in his chest. The eastern courtyard, designed as a killing ground, had somehow transformed into the birthplace of something he couldn't yet name. As they crossed the threshold into the mansion's warmth, Kiva stumbled slightly, her legs finally surrendering to exhaustion and fever. Holden moved without thinking, catching her before Phantom could react, lifting the girl with shocking gentleness for someone whose hands had orchestrated violence across 3 states. She weighed almost nothing, her small body burning with fever against his chest. Kiva's eyes met his for a long moment, and Holden saw something there that made his breath catch. Recognition, but not of him. Recognition of something he represented, some role he was being called to fill without having auditioned for the part. Dr. Morrison arrived 40 minutes later, his silver hair and expensive briefcase marking him as the kind of physician who catered to clients requiring absolute discretion. He'd treated various members of Holden's organization over the years, asking no questions about knife wounds or bullet grazes that never appeared in official records. But his expression upon entering the guest suite showed genuine concern rather than his usual professional detachment at the sight of Kiva lying on imported sheets that cost more than most families spent on rent. Celeste had already begun preliminary treatment, establishing an IV line with practiced efficiency, despite working outside her veterinary specialty. She'd stripped away Kiva's filthy clothes, replacing them with an oversized t-shirt from the mansion's supply, revealing the full extent of the girl's malnutrition. Her ribs stood out in sharp relief, and bruises in various stages of healing decorated her arms and legs, not abuse marks but the accumulated damage of survival on streets that showed no mercy to the vulnerable. Dr. Morrison's examination was thorough and gentle, his hands moving with the careful precision of someone who understood that touch could either heal or traumatize. He checked reflexes, listened to heart and lungs, examined the condition of her teeth and gums for signs of scurvy or other deficiency diseases. Kiva endured this with stoic silence, her eyes tracking Phantom, who'd positioned himself in the room's corner, refusing to be separated from her despite Holden's initial attempts at removal. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, exposure-related fever, and what I suspect is pneumonia developing in her left lung, Dr. Morrison announced, his clinical assessment delivered in tones that carried no judgment about how a child had reached this condition. She needs IV antibiotics, proper nutrition reintroduced gradually to avoid refeeding syndrome, and constant monitoring for the next 72 hours minimum. Ideally, she'd be hospitalized, but I understand that's not an option you're considering. Holden stood near the door, arms crossed, watching the medical procedures with the same intense focus he applied to business negotiations where millions hung in the balance. But this felt different. The stakes were somehow both smaller and infinitely larger than money or territory. Celeste glanced at him periodically, her expression unreadable, but her actions speaking clearly about her commitment to Keva's welfare regardless of her opinions about the mansion's owner. I can set up everything needed here, Dr. Morrison continued, pulling out his phone to arrange for medical supplies and equipment. But she'll require round-the-clock care from someone with medical training. I can arrange for a private nurse, though that adds another person into your situation. The delicate pause before situation acknowledged the criminal context without explicitly naming it, a linguistic dance both men had perfected over years of irregular consultations. Celeste's voice cut through before Holden could respond, her French-Canadian accent sharpening with decision. "I'll stay. I have medical training beyond veterinary work, pre-med before I specialized, and she seems to trust me, which matters more than credentials right now." She directed this statement at Dr. Morrison rather than Holden, claiming authority over the patient's emotional needs that superseded the crime lord's property rights. Holden found himself nodding agreement before analyzing the implications of having Celeste essentially move into his compound for an indefinite period. The veterinarian had always maintained careful professional distance, arriving for Phantom's care and departing with minimal social interaction. Now she was volunteering to embed herself in his household, motivated by concern for a child whose connection to his dog remained unexplained. The situation was spiraling beyond his control in ways that should have triggered defensive responses, but instead felt almost inevitable. Kiva's eyes had closed during the examination, fever and exhaustion finally overwhelming whatever reserves had kept her functioning through her approach to the mansion. But her hand remained extended toward Phantom's corner, fingers making small grasping motions as if seeking reassurance that the dog was still present. Phantom responded by moving closer, stretching his massive body alongside the bed within reach of her searching fingers, his presence apparently more effective than any medication at providing comfort. "What's the dog's connection to her?" Dr. Morrison asked, his clinical curiosity overriding professional boundaries, as he observed the interaction between child and beast. "I've never seen a cane corso display this kind of protective behavior toward anyone except their primary handler, and even then, it's usually more possessive than nurturing." His eyes moved from Phantom to Holden, seeking explanation for the behavioral anomaly that even medical training couldn't rationalize. Holden exchanged glances with Celeste, recognizing that they shared ignorance about the fundamental mystery driving everything that had happened tonight. "That's what we're trying to understand," he said, the admission of not knowing costing him more than he'd anticipated. Men in his position didn't acknowledge gaps in information, didn't reveal uncertainty that could be exploited as weakness. Yet here he stood, confessing confusion to his private physician about a homeless child and a dog who'd apparently rewritten their own relationship rules. Dr. Morrison packed his examination equipment with methodical precision, leaving behind supplies and detailed instructions for Kiva's care over the coming days. "I'll return tomorrow morning to reassess her condition. Call me immediately if her fever spikes above 103 or if she shows any respiratory distress. The pneumonia is early stage, but it can progress rapidly in someone this compromised." He paused at the door, adding with unusual directness, "She's lucky you brought her inside. Another night on the streets in her condition would likely have been fatal." The word lucky hung in the air after Dr. Morrison's departure, its implications reverberating through Holden's consciousness. Luck implied chance, random occurrence, but nothing about Kiva's arrival felt random. She'd navigated directly to his compound, bypassed security protocols that had repelled professional infiltrators, and spoken a word that rewrote Phantom's behavioral programming. Whatever had brought her here operated according to logic he didn't yet understand, but couldn't dismiss as mere fortune. Celeste began organizing the medical supplies Dr. Morrison had left, transforming the guest suite into a functional hospital room with the efficiency of someone comfortable in crisis situations. She set up monitoring equipment, prepared medication schedules, arranged the IV bags on their stand with practiced precision. Holden watched her work, noting how she moved around Phantom without fear, accepting the dog's presence as non-negotiable rather than attempting to assert human authority over the space. "I'll need access to a kitchen for preparing appropriate meals as she begins eating solid food," Celeste said, without looking at Holden, her focus on adjusting Kiva's IV flow rate. "And I assume you have security footage of how she actually got onto the property? Understanding her physical capabilities before collapse might help predict her recovery trajectory." The questions were framed as professional necessities, but Holden detected underlying curiosity about the mystery that had drawn them all into this unprecedented situation. "I'll have the kitchen staff briefed and the security footage compiled," Holden replied, moving toward the door but finding himself reluctant to leave the room where so many impossibilities had concentrated. He paused at the threshold, watching Kiva's small chest rise and fall with labored breaths, while Phantom maintained his vigil. "Why did you really volunteer to stay? You've made your disapproval of my business clear enough over the years. This goes beyond professional obligation." Celeste's hands stilled on the medical equipment, and for a long moment, she didn't respond, her back still turned to him. When she finally spoke, her voice carried layers of meaning that went beyond the simple words. Because that child trusted an animal that was trained to kill, and the animal remembered something worth protecting. That kind of connection doesn't happen by accident. Whatever brought her here, whatever she represents, it matters, and someone needs to make sure she survives long enough to explain it. Holden descended to his office, where his head of security had compiled footage from 16 different cameras, tracking Kiva's approach to the compound. The timeline began at 6:47 p.m. when thermal sensors first detected her presence 3 blocks away, moving with purposeful direction rather than the wandering patterns of typical homeless individuals. She'd walked past 2 other wealthy estates without pause, her trajectory locked on Holden's property with navigational certainty that suggested prior knowledge of the address. The footage showed her studying the delivery entrance for nearly 4 minutes before finding the gap in the gate, her small hands testing the metal with systematic thoroughness that spoke to problem-solving skills beyond her years. She'd slipped through the opening with the fluid efficiency of someone who'd learned to make herself small, to fit into spaces others overlooked. No hesitation, no fear visible in her body language, even as she entered territory that should have terrified any rational person. What struck Holden most forcefully was the moment captured when Kiva first saw the mansion. She'd stopped, stared at the building's eastern wing, and nodded to herself as if confirming something she'd already known. Then her path had shifted slightly, abandoning the most direct route to the main entrance in favor of the trajectory that led specifically to the eastern courtyard. She'd known where Phantom would be, had deliberately sought out the most dangerous location on the property. His investigator had already begun running Kiva's description through missing persons databases and facial recognition software connected to social services systems across multiple states. But Holden suspected these searches would yield nothing. The girl moved like someone who'd learned to exist beneath official notice, a ghost in systems designed to track and categorize citizens. Her survival skills suggested months, or possibly years of living outside normal social structures. Celeste appeared in the doorway carrying a tablet, her expression troubled in ways that had nothing to do with Kiva's medical condition. "I've been reviewing Phantom's veterinary records and purchase documentation. There's something you need to see." She crossed to his desk, placing the tablet between them, her finger pointing to a specific line in the breeder's transfer papers. The dog wasn't originally named Phantom. That's what you called him after purchase. His registered name from the Italian breeder was Ombra del Passato. Holden leaned forward, his knowledge of Italian sufficient to translate the phrase, shadow of the past. The breeder's paperwork says he was part of a specialized training program for protection animals, but before that placement, there's a 3-month gap in his documentation. He was in some kind of rehabilitation facility. Celeste pulled up another document, this one showing a transfer agreement between the Italian breeder and an American animal sanctuary that had since closed. The sanctuary operated illegally out of a converted warehouse in the industrial district, Celeste continued, her research having obviously progressed rapidly during the hour she'd spent with Kiva upstairs. It was run by a couple who specialized in rehabilitating traumatized animals, abuse cases, fighting ring survivors, creatures that other facilities had given up on. They were shut down by the city after a fire 6 months ago. Both owners died in the blaze. The implications crashed through Holden's consciousness like physical impact, pieces of the impossible puzzle suddenly arranging themselves into patterns that made terrible sense. Phantom was at that sanctuary, and if the couple had a child, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Celeste's expression confirmed she'd already followed the same logical thread to its devastating conclusion. "I called a contact at the fire marshal's office," Celeste said, her voice dropping to the subdued tones reserved for discussing tragedy. The couple who died were named David and Sarah Okonkwo. They had a 7-year-old daughter who was listed as deceased in the fire. Her body was never recovered, but the assumption was that she'd been consumed by the flames. Her name was Kiva. Holden stared at the security footage frozen on his screen, the image of a small figure approaching his gates with such determined purpose. Not a random homeless child seeking shelter, but a girl who'd spent 6 months searching for one specific thing that had survived the fire that took her parents, a dog who remembered her. She called him by his original name. That's what she whispered in the courtyard. Not Phantom, but whatever nickname they used at the sanctuary. "Umbra," Celeste confirmed, pulling up yet another document. This one a photograph from the sanctuary's archived social media presence before the fire. The image showed a younger, thinner Phantom being held by a small girl with gap-toothed smile and bright eyes that held none of the haunted depth Holden had seen tonight. The caption read, Keva and Ombra making progress. This sweet boy is finally learning to trust again. The date stamp placed the photos 7 months prior. The transformation in Phantom suddenly made complete sense. The dog hadn't been reacting to a stranger, but recognizing someone he'd believed dead. Someone whose loss had likely contributed to the aggressive behavior that made him such an effective guard animal. His training hadn't been overridden by a magic word, but by memory stronger than conditioning, by loyalty that transcended the months of separation and violence he'd experienced since leaving the sanctuary. Holden felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest as he absorbed this information, not the strategic calculation he applied to most situations, but something rawer and more human. Keva had survived her parents' deaths, lived on streets for half a year, and somehow tracked down the one living thing that connected her to the life she'd lost. The courage and desperation required for such a journey was beyond anything he'd encountered in his criminal career. "Does she know her parents are dead?" Holden asked, the question emerging before he'd consciously decided to voice it. Celeste shook her head slowly, her expression carrying the weight of knowledge that would need to be delivered carefully. "She hasn't spoken about them yet. Either she's still processing the trauma, or she's in denial about what happened. Either way, we'll need to address it eventually, but not while she's fighting pneumonia and malnutrition. I want complete background on the fire. Official reports, insurance investigations, everything," Holden said, his mind shifting into the operational mode he understood better than emotional territory. "If there's any question about how it started, any indication of arson or foul play, I need to know. And I want to know what happened to the other animals from that sanctuary, where they were placed, if any others survived besides Phantom." Celeste studied him with an expression that mixed surprise and calculation, as if reassessing conclusions she'd reached about his character over years of professional interaction. "Why does it matter to you? She's just a homeless child who happened to find your dog. You could turn her over to social services. Let the system handle her recovery and placement. Why are you involving yourself in something that has nothing to do with your business?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty Holden rarely offered anyone. He looked at the frozen image of Keva on his screen, remembering the weight of her fevered body in his arms, the way Phantom had looked at him with expectation rather than submission. Because that dog changed his entire nature to protect her, and if a creature trained to kill can recognize something worth preserving, maybe I should pay attention to what he sees that I'm missing. Holden returned to the guest suite near midnight to find Celeste dozing in the chair beside Keva's bed, medical charts balanced on her lap, and exhaustion evident in the lines around her eyes. Phantom remained alert despite the late hour, his massive head resting on the bed's edge within inches of Keva's hand. The dog's eyes tracked Holden's entrance, but showed none of the territorial aggression that usually marked his responses to nighttime movements within the compound. Keva's fever had broken slightly according to the monitors, her temperature dropping from dangerous heights to merely concerning levels. The IV dripped steadily, replacing fluids and delivering antibiotics that fought the pneumonia trying to establish itself in her compromised lungs. Her breathing remained labored but steady, each inhale and exhale a small victory against the accumulated damage of 6-month surviving conditions designed to destroy rather than sustain. Holden moved quietly to avoid waking Celeste, but the veterinarian stirred anyway, her eyes opening with the instant alertness of someone trained to respond to emergencies regardless of sleep deprivation. "Her vitals are stabilizing," Celeste reported softly, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Dr. Morrison's antibiotic choice seems to be working. If she makes it through the next 48 hours without complications, she should recover physically, though the psychological trauma is another matter entirely. I found out who she is," Holden said, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing Keva's fever-restless sleep. He pulled up the sanctuary photo on his phone, showing Celeste the image of the girl and dog in happier circumstances. Her parents ran the animal sanctuary where Phantom, Ombra, spent 3 months in rehabilitation. They died in the fire that shut the place down. She's been on the streets ever since, apparently searching for him. Celeste took the phone, studying the photograph with an expression that cycled through shock, grief, and something approaching awe. She spent 6 months looking for one dog among all the animals that must have been scattered from that sanctuary? How did she even know he'd ended up here? Her questions voiced the same puzzles that had been circling through Holden's mind since discovering Keva's identity. "I don't know yet, but I will," Holden replied, taking back his phone and pocketing it. "I've got people researching the sanctuary's records, tracking where all the animals were placed. Maybe she'd been systematically searching through adoption and sales records, or maybe she heard street talk about my compound's guard dog. Either way, she found him, and he remembered her despite everything that happened since they were separated. They stood in silence for several moments, watching Keva's small chest rise and fall, while Phantom maintained his vigil with the patience of a creature who'd finally found what he'd been missing. The room felt heavy with accumulated significance, as if the universe had contracted to focus all its attention on this one recovering child, and the connections radiating outward from her presence. "What happens when she wakes up?" Celeste asked, her voice carrying genuine uncertainty rather than her usual professional confidence. "When she's strong enough to talk, to process where she is and what brought her here, you can't keep her hidden indefinitely. There are legal issues, custody questions, not to mention the psychological support she'll need after losing her parents and living rough for 6 months." Holden had been avoiding these practical considerations, letting the immediate medical crisis take precedence over longer-term planning. But Celeste's questions forced him to confront realities he couldn't indefinitely postpone. "First, she recovers. Then we figure out what she needs and how to provide it. I have resources most people can't access: private therapists, legal experts who specialize in complex custody situations. The system that declared her dead doesn't need to know she survived unless it serves her interests." "You're talking about essentially kidnapping her from official oversight," Celeste said, though her tone carried more contemplation than accusation. "Keeping her off the grid, using your criminal connections to circumvent legal processes designed to protect children. How is that in her best interest rather than simply convenient for you?" The challenge was direct but not hostile, seeking understanding rather than scoring points in an argument. Holden met her gaze without flinching, recognizing that honesty mattered more in this moment than maintaining his carefully constructed persona. Because the system declared her dead based on convenience and incomplete evidence. Because she survived 6 months that should have killed her through pure determination to find one connection to her lost life. Because Phantom recognized something in her worth protecting, and I've learned to trust that dogs' instincts more than I trust most humans. Is that a good enough reason? Celeste didn't answer immediately, her attention shifting back to Kiva, who'd moved slightly in her sleep, hand finding Phantom's fur and gripping it with unconscious need for contact. The dog didn't react except to breathe steadily, accepting the touch as his due, as something he'd been waiting for since the fire that separated them. The veterinarian's expression softened watching this connection, her professional boundaries eroding in the face of obvious devotion. "I'll stay through her recovery," Celeste said finally, her decision emerging with the weight of commitment rather than casual agreement. "Not because I approve of your methods or your business, but because she deserves someone who will prioritize her welfare over legal conveniences or criminal expediencies. I'll be her advocate in this situation, which means I'll push back against you when necessary. Can you accept those terms?" Holden felt a smile tugging at his mouth, despite the serious nature of their conversation. Celeste's fierce protectiveness reminded him why he'd kept her on contract, despite her obvious distaste for his operations. She possessed integrity that couldn't be purchased or intimidated, the kind of moral clarity he'd long since abandoned, but still recognized as valuable. "I wouldn't want it any other way. She needs someone who'll fight for her interests, even if that means fighting me." A soft sound from the bed drew both their attentions. Kiva's eyes had opened, fever-bright and unfocused, scanning the unfamiliar room with confusion that bordered on panic. Her hand tightened in Phantom's fur, seeking anchor in the one familiar thing her disoriented mind could recognize. The dog responded immediately, lifting his head to her hand, rumbling reassurance deep in his chest that seemed to penetrate the fever's haze. "Ombra," Kiva whispered, the name emerging rough and broken from her damaged throat. Then her eyes found Holden and Celeste standing beside the bed, and wariness replaced confusion in her expression. "Where?" she began, the question trailing off as speaking triggered coughing that racked her small frame. Celeste moved immediately, adjusting pillows and offering water through a straw, her hands gentle but competent. "You're safe," Celeste said, once the coughing subsided, her accented voice carrying warmth designed to penetrate fear. "You got very sick, so we brought you inside to make you better. My name is Celeste. I'm a doctor, and this is Mr. Cross. Do you remember coming here? Do you remember finding Ombra in the courtyard?" Her questions were carefully calibrated to assess both Keva's cognitive function and her memory of recent events. Keva's eyes moved from Celeste to Holden, then to Phantom, who had risen to his feet, positioning himself where she could see his face without strain. Recognition flickered through her fever-dulled gaze, and with it came something that might have been relief, or might have been resignation. "I found him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying absolute certainty. "I promised Mama I'd find him before she—" The sentence broke on a sob that transformed into more coughing. Holden felt his chest constrict, watching this small display of grief and determination, colliding in one exhausted child. She'd kept a promise to her dying mother, had survived impossible circumstances to fulfill that final obligation. The courage required for such devotion was staggering, the kind of loyalty he'd spent his career trying to purchase and command, but rarely witnessed in its pure form. Phantom pressed closer to the bed, offering his bulk as comfort, while Kiva's thin fingers dug into his fur like lifeline. Over the next 3 days, Kiva's physical condition improved with the steady progression that medical intervention and proper nutrition made possible. Her fever broke completely on the second morning, and the pneumonia began responding to antibiotics with encouraging speed. Celeste maintained constant vigilance, adjusting treatment protocols and coaxing small amounts of easily digestible food into a stomach that had forgotten what regular meals felt like. Phantom never left the room except for brief bathroom breaks in the courtyard, always returning with urgent speed as if fearing Kiva might disappear during his absence. Holden found himself making excuses to check on her progress throughout each day, his usual business operations taking secondary priority to updates on a 7-year-old's vital signs. His organization ran smoothly without constant oversight, the machine he'd built requiring only occasional guidance to maintain momentum. Something about Kiva's recovery demanded his attention in ways that had nothing to do with strategic value or operational necessity. He began recognizing this pull as the same instinct that had made Phantom abandon his training, recognition of something worth protecting that transcended rational calculation. Celeste noticed these frequent visits, but made no comment beyond raised eyebrows that suggested she was cataloging data for future analysis. She'd moved into the guest suite adjacent to Kiva's room, transforming it into combination living quarters and medical station. Her veterinary practice had been put on hold through carefully worded messages to clients about family emergency, a lie that served truth in ways she hadn't anticipated. The mansion's staff adapted to her presence with the same professional flexibility they applied to all of Holden's unusual requests. Kiva began speaking more on the third day, her voice gaining strength along with her body. She talked about her parents in present tense initially, as if the 6 months since the fire had been temporary separation rather than permanent loss. Celeste gently corrected these references, helping her process grief that had been frozen by survival necessity. The conversations were painful to witness, a child's understanding colliding with adult reality, hope crumbling beneath weight of truth she'd been avoiding through sheer willpower. "Mama told me to find Ombra if anything happened," Kiva said during one of these talks, her small hand stroking Phantom's head with movements that had become constant comfort ritual. "She said he'd remember me. The dogs don't forget people they love." Her eyes had filled with tears that finally spilled over. 6 months of suppressed grief finding release now that she'd accomplished the mission that had kept her functioning. Celeste held her while she cried, offering the kind of maternal comfort that couldn't be replaced by medical competence alone. Phantom pressed against the bed, whining softly in distress at sounds that clearly troubled him, despite his inability to comprehend their source. Holden stood in the doorway during this breakdown, witnessing vulnerability that made his chest ache with unfamiliar emotions. He'd built an empire on exploiting weakness, on identifying leverage points in people's defenses, and applying pressure until they broke according to his design. But watching Kiva's grief felt different, not opportunity to exploit, but something demanding protection from a world that had already taken too much from someone too young to have developed adequate defenses. Later that evening, after Kiva had cried herself into exhausted sleep, and Celeste had stepped out for coffee, Holden found himself alone in the room with the girl and dog. He sat in the chair Celeste usually occupied, studying Kiva's face in repose, the lingering bruises fading to yellow-green, the hollows beneath her cheekbones beginning to fill out with proper nutrition. Her hand remained tangled in Phantom's fur even in sleep, unconscious need for contact overriding rest. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with you," Holden said quietly, speaking to Kiva's sleeping form though she couldn't hear him. "I'm not equipped for this. I don't do redemption arcs or surrogate parenting. My business is control and consequences, not healing damaged children who trust dogs more than humans." The words emerged as confession to someone who couldn't judge him for the admission. Phantom's amber eyes opened, fixing on Holden with an expression that might have been reproach or might have been expectation. The dog had made his choice clear. Kiva mattered more than training, more than loyalty to the master who'd purchased him. Holden felt challenged by that stare, as if the animal was demanding he rise to standards that had nothing to do with criminal success or accumulated power. His phone buzzed with messages from his second-in-command about territorial disputes requiring attention, contracts needing approval, violence that required orchestration or prevention, the machinery of his empire demanding the oil of his focus to continue operating smoothly. But Holden silenced the phone without reading past the first notification, his attention remaining on the small figure in the hospital bed who'd somehow become more important than business he'd spent years building. Celeste returned carrying 2 coffee cups, passing one to Holden without comment about finding him in her usual chair. She settled into the room's other seat, sipping her drink while maintaining the comfortable silence of people who'd moved past need for constant conversation. They sat together watching Keva sleep, 2 people from completely different worlds united by shared commitment to someone who'd accidentally revealed the best parts of themselves they'd forgotten existed. "My investigator found records from the animal sanctuary," Holden said eventually, breaking the silence with information he'd been processing since receiving the report that afternoon. Kiva's parents were considered eccentric by neighbors. They lived in the warehouse with the animals, spent every cent on veterinary care and rehabilitation programs. The fire started in the electrical system around 3 a.m. They'd evacuated 43 animals before the structure collapsed. Celeste absorbed this information with the same careful attention she applied to medical diagnoses, extracting meaning from facts that painted picture of the girl's background. So she grew up surrounded by damaged creatures learning to trust again. That explains why she approached Phantom without fear. She'd spent her whole life around animals that others considered dangerous. She saw past the aggression to the pain underneath. "The fire marshal's report says they found her parents near the back exit," Holden continued, his voice dropping lower, though Kiva showed no signs of waking. "They'd gone back in for one more animal despite being told the building was about to collapse. Never made it back out. Kiva was listed as deceased because her bedroom was in the section that burned hottest. Investigators assumed she'd been overcome by smoke before she could escape. But she hadn't been in her bedroom," Celeste realized, following the logical thread to its obvious conclusion. She was with the animals they'd already evacuated. She watched her parents go back inside and not come out. Then she watched the building collapse with them inside. And she's been trying to fulfill her mother's last instruction ever since. Find Ombra. Make sure he's safe. The weight of that realization settled over them both, adding layers of understanding to Keva's determined approach to the mansion despite obvious danger. She hadn't been reckless or foolishly brave. She'd been completing a mission that gave purpose to survival that might otherwise have felt meaningless. Finding Phantom meant honoring her parents' life work, proving their deaths hadn't been entirely in vain, because at least one of their rescued animals had found safety. By the end of the first week, Keva was strong enough to leave the bed for short periods, exploring the guest suite with cautious curiosity while Phantom shadowed her every movement. She touched everything with careful reverence, as if the luxury surrounding her existed in a different reality than the one she'd inhabited for 6 months. Celeste encouraged this exploration, recognizing that reclaiming agency over her environment was a crucial step in psychological recovery. Holden had his legal team researching custody options and bureaucratic pathways that might allow Kiva to remain in his care without triggering system intervention. The challenge was substantial. Single man with criminal empire seeking to adopt child officially declared dead, whom he'd effectively kidnapped, by not reporting her survival to authorities. His lawyers approached the problem with the same creative interpretation of regulations they applied to his business operations. Meanwhile, the mansion staff had begun treating Keva's presence as permanent fixture, rather than temporary anomaly. The cook prepared child-friendly meals tailored to her recovering digestive system, and the head housekeeper had quietly acquired age-appropriate clothing in Kiva's size. No one had explicitly stated that she was staying, but the infrastructure supporting that assumption built itself through accumulated small actions that acknowledged reality before it had been officially declared. Celeste watched these developments with mixed feelings. She didn't fully articulate even to herself. Her initial commitment to staying through Kiva's medical crisis had evolved into something more complex. Investment in the girl's long-term welfare that went beyond professional obligation. She'd begun imagining futures for Kiva that included stability, education, the kind of childhood that had been stolen by fire and circumstance. But she also recognized the moral complications of those futures being built inside a crime lord's fortress. What happens when she's fully recovered? Celeste asked Holden during one of their late-night conversations that had become routine over the past week. They sat in his study while Kiva slept upstairs under Phantom's vigilant guard, the quiet hours after midnight, creating space for discussions too complex for daytime. You can't keep her hidden forever. Eventually, someone will notice. A neighbor, a delivery person, someone who will ask questions you can't answer without exposing the whole situation. Holden swirled whiskey in his glass, studying the amber liquid as if it contained answers to questions that had no easy solutions. My lawyers think they can establish legal guardianship through family court, if we construct the right narrative. Claim I've been caring for a distant relative's child after parents died, that proper channels were followed but paperwork was delayed. Judges in this city owe me favors. Not ideal foundation for custody, but better than the alternatives. You're talking about corrupting the legal system to legitimize kidnapping, Celeste said, though her tone carried more resignation than accusation. She'd crossed enough ethical lines in the past week that moral high ground had become difficult terrain to claim convincingly. What happens if she grows up and realizes her whole life was built on lies and manipulation? That the man she trusted was actually a criminal who bent laws to keep her because it suited his purposes? The question hit harder than Holden wanted to acknowledge, striking at insecurities he'd been avoiding through focus on immediate logistics. Then I hope she'll understand I did the best I could with limited options. That keeping her safe mattered more than perfect adherence to systems that declared her dead without proper investigation. Is that good enough? Probably not, but it's what I have to offer. Celeste set down her coffee cup, her expression shifting to something more vulnerable than her usual professional competence. Why does this matter so much to you? I've watched you operate with calculated detachment for years. Everything is strategy and leverage, costs and benefits. But with Kiva, you're making decisions that don't serve your interests. You're risking exposure, legal complications, all for a child you met a week ago. What changed? Holden didn't answer immediately. Recognizing that honesty required excavating motivations he'd been avoiding examining too closely. I've spent 15 years building an empire on fear and control. I'm very good at making people do what I want through careful application of pressure and consequence. But Phantom chose Kiva over 2 years of training and conditioning without hesitation. That kind of loyalty can't be purchased or intimidated. It has to be earned through being worth protecting. And you want to be worth protecting, Celeste said softly, completing the thought he'd been circling around without directly stating. You want to believe you're more than the sum of your criminal operations, that you're capable of being someone a damaged child and devoted dog can trust. This isn't about saving Kiva. It's about proving to yourself that you're still savable. The accuracy of her assessment was uncomfortable in ways that made Holden want to retreat behind defensive walls he'd constructed over years of operating in spaces where vulnerability meant death. But something about Celeste's steady gaze and the late hour and the accumulated weight of the week stripped away usual protections. Maybe, he admitted. Or maybe I just recognize that she's already lost everything once. Letting the system take her means she loses everything again. I have resources to prevent that. Using them seems like minimum requirement for being even marginally decent. A soft sound from the doorway made them both turn. Kiva stood in the entrance wearing oversized pajamas that belonged to one of the mansion staff. Phantom pressed against her side in protective formation. Her eyes were red-rimmed from recent tears, and her expression carried the fragility of someone who'd woken from nightmares that memory wouldn't release. I had a bad dream, she said, voice small and uncertain, in ways that daytime bravery usually disguised. Celeste rose immediately, moving toward Kiva with arms extended in invitation rather than demand. Come here, sweetheart. Let's get you back to bed. But Kiva's eyes had fixed on Holden, studying him with intensity that felt like judgment, or assessment, or perhaps simple curiosity about the man whose house she'd invaded and whose life she'd disrupted through the simple act of survival. Are you going to make me leave? Kiva asked, the question emerging with directness that bypassed social niceties children usually learn to employ. When I'm better, are you sending me away to people who don't know Ombre? To places where he can't come? Her hand tightened in Phantom's fur, the gesture revealing what mattered most. Not her own comfort or safety, but maintaining connection to the dog who represented her last link to parents and home. Holden felt the weight of that question pressing down with physical force, aware that his answer would establish foundation for whatever relationship developed between them. Lies or reassurances that might prove false later would poison any trust she was considering extending. I'm trying to figure out how to keep you both safe and together, he said, choosing honesty over comfort. It's complicated because I'm not exactly model guardian material, but I promise I won't separate you from Phantom. Whatever happens, wherever you end up, he goes with you. Kiva processed this response with the same careful consideration she'd applied to approaching Phantom in the courtyard, weighing risks against potential rewards, calculating whether trust was gamble worth taking. Mama said good people keep their promises even when it's hard. Are you a good person? The question was delivered without judgment. Simple request for information that would help her navigate uncertain territory. The question hung in the air, while Holden struggled with answers that couldn't be reduced to simple affirmation or denial. I'm trying to be better than I have been, he said finally, offering truth that was more complex but perhaps more honest than she'd expected. I've done things I'm not proud of, hurt people who probably didn't deserve it, but I keep my promises, and I'm promising you now that Phantom stays with you no matter what. Kiva studied him for several more seconds, then nodded as if reaching conclusion that satisfied whatever criteria she'd been applying. Okay, I believe you. The simple declaration carried weight beyond its brevity. Trust extended with the same courage she'd shown approaching a supposedly vicious dog. She allowed Celeste to guide her back toward the stairs, Phantom falling into step beside her, leaving Holden standing in his study with the uncomfortable awareness that he'd just committed himself to being someone he wasn't sure he knew how to become. Celeste paused at the doorway, looking back at Holden with expression that mixed approval with lingering concern. Children are remarkably perceptive about authenticity. She knows you're struggling with this, but she also knows you're being honest about that struggle. Don't make me regret believing you'll follow through. The warning was delivered gently, but contained steel that reminded him why he'd valued her integrity, even when it complicated his operations. After they'd gone upstairs, Holden remained in his study, staring at his reflection in the window that overlooked the eastern courtyard where everything had begun. 7 days ago, his biggest concern had been maintaining territorial control and managing rival operations. Now he was researching family court procedures and making promises to a traumatized 7-year-old about providing the stability her ruined life desperately needed. The transformation felt both absurd and somehow inevitable, as if Kiva's arrival had been designed to demolish carefully constructed walls between the man he'd become and whoever he might have been under different circumstances. His phone buzzed again with business requiring attention, violence needing orchestration, the machinery of his empire grinding forward with or without his constant supervision. But Holden found himself thinking about Kiva's question, "Are you a good person?" and recognizing that whatever answer he wanted to give, it would be determined by actions rather than intentions. Being good wasn't about avoiding criminal operations he'd already committed to, but about how he chose to exercise power in circumstances where someone vulnerable depended on him to be better than convenient. 2 weeks after Kiva's arrival, she was strong enough to venture outside with Phantom, the two of them exploring the mansion's grounds with the joy of prisoners granted unexpected freedom. Holden watched from his office window as girl and dog raced across the lawn, her laughter carrying through glass barriers that had never seemed quite so isolating before. Celeste supervised from nearby, her presence ensuring safety while allowing Kiva the independence she needed to reclaim agency over her own existence. The investigation into the sanctuary fire had yielded disturbing information that Holden's team presented during a private meeting. The electrical failure that started the blaze showed signs of deliberate tampering, though the original investigation had been cursory enough to miss evidence that more thorough examination revealed. The sanctuary had been operating illegally, but not harmfully, saving animals that shelters and rescue organizations had deemed beyond saving. Someone had wanted them shut down permanently, the kind of thorough elimination that suggested professional work rather than random tragedy. Holden's investigator had traced financial records showing that the warehouse property had been purchased immediately after the fire by a development company connected to one of his rival organizations. The sanctuary had been occupying valuable real estate in an area being gentrified, and its eccentric operators had refused multiple buyout offers. The fire had solved a problem that legal channels hadn't resolved quickly enough, though proving this connection would require resources and time he wasn't sure he wanted to invest. But the information changed context around Kiva's survival and her parents' deaths, transforming random tragedy into calculated murder that had almost succeeded in eliminating the entire family. Telling Kiva that her parents hadn't just died but had been killed required consultation with Celeste about psychological impact versus right to truth. They agreed to wait until she was stronger, until the foundation of her recovery was solid enough to withstand additional trauma without collapsing back into survival mode that had nearly killed her. Meanwhile, Holden's legal team had constructed guardianship framework that would withstand scrutiny assuming cooperative judges and minimal investigation. The narrative positioned him as distant family friend, who'd been contacted by neighbors after the fire, who'd been searching for Kiva through private channels, while official investigation had declared her dead. Documentation had been carefully backdated and filed through channels that established paper trails supporting this fiction. It wasn't bulletproof, but it was sufficient for systems that preferred convenient explanations over complicated truth. Celeste had her own decisions to make about how long she'd remain embedded in Holden's compound as Kiva's primary caregiver. Her veterinary practice couldn't be indefinitely postponed, and the professional life she'd built existed separately from the one developing in the mansion's guest wing. But she found herself reluctant to leave, invested in Kiva's welfare in ways that went beyond temporary crisis response. The girl needed stability and consistency, things that required commitment rather than passing involvement. "I've been thinking about Keva's education," Celeste said during one of their evening discussions that had become essential ritual. "She'll need schooling, socialization with other children, experiences beyond this compound. Home tutoring could work initially, but eventually she'll need broader engagement. Have you considered how that works given your lifestyle?" The delicate phrasing acknowledged complications that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Holden had been avoiding this question along with dozens of others that long-term custody entailed. Private school with security protocols, driver who's also trained protection, carefully managed interaction that lets her develop normally while minimizing exposure to things she shouldn't see or questions she shouldn't have to answer. It's not ideal, but it's better than alternatives. His answer sounded defensive even to his own ears. Awareness that no solution perfectly balanced Kiva's needs against his limitations. "You're describing the childhood of a mob boss's daughter," Celeste pointed out with characteristic directness. "Isolated, protected, surrounded by security that reminds her constantly that her life isn't normal. That's going to shape her in ways that might not be healthy, regardless of your good intentions. Have you thought about whether she might be better off with a normal family, away from all this?" The question struck at core fears Holden had been suppressing through focus on immediate logistics. "Every day," he admitted, the confession costing more than he'd anticipated. "But she chose to come here. She spent 6 months searching for Phantom, and he's bonded to me in ways that make separation traumatic for both of them. Breaking that connection to give her normal childhood means taking away the one thing that's keeping her anchored. That doesn't seem like better option." Celeste's expression softened slightly, recognizing the genuine dilemma beneath Holden's rationalizations. "Then we need to make sure this environment doesn't damage her further. That means boundaries between your business and her life, therapy to process trauma she's survived, and people around her who'll prioritize her welfare over your convenience. I'll stay as long as she needs me, but you need to understand I'm here for her, not for you. If I think this situation is harming her, I'll intervene regardless of your wishes." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Holden said, meaning it more than she probably believed. "You're right to be protective. She needs someone who'll push back against me when necessary. I'm new at this, and probably going to make mistakes. Having you here means those mistakes might get caught before they cause permanent damage." The admission of inadequacy was uncomfortable but necessary, establishing foundation for collaboration rather than conflict. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching security monitors showing Kiva and Phantom exploring the grounds under floodlights that turned evening into artificial day. The girl was teaching the dog tricks he'd never learned during combat training, and Phantom was performing them with enthusiasm that erased his previous reputation as untouchable predator. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Girl learning to trust again, dog remembering gentleness that training had suppressed but not eliminated. "She's going to ask about the fire eventually," Celeste said quietly. "About what really happened and why. The truth about it being arson, about someone deliberately killing her parents. That's going to require answers you may not want to give, because those answers lead to questions about what you do and how you operate. Are you prepared for her to know who you really are?" Holden had been avoiding this inevitability, along with all the others that long-term custody entailed. "No, but I don't think being prepared is possible. She'll find out eventually, regardless of what I tell her or hide from her. Kids aren't stupid, and she's sharper than most. Best I can do is try to be honest when she asks, and hope that honesty counts for something when she's old enough to understand the full implications." A notification on his phone interrupted their conversation. The guardianship hearing had been scheduled for the following week, expedited through judicial connections that turned months-long processes into days. The message included briefing documents about what to expect, how to present the situation, which questions would likely arise, and how to answer them in ways that satisfied legal requirements without exposing uncomfortable truths. It was theater, carefully choreographed performance where everyone knew their roles and outcomes had been predetermined through channels that existed outside official procedures. Celeste read his expression correctly, understanding without explanation that bureaucratic machinery had been set in motion. So it's happening. She'll officially become your ward, your responsibility in eyes of legal system. After that, there's no easy way to undo this. If you change your mind, or decide it's too complicated, you'll be committed to seeing this through until she's an adult, or circumstances change dramatically. Last chance to reconsider before this becomes permanent. I'm not reconsidering, Holden said, the decision feeling more certain than most he'd made in years of criminal operations. She deserves better than what I can offer, but she's not getting better options. The system declared her dead and moved on. The family that might have taken her doesn't exist or doesn't know she survived. What's left is me and this compound and Phantom. It's not what anyone would choose as ideal, but it's what we have. I'm going to make it work. Celeste studied him with expression that mixed assessment and something that might have been respect, though she'd never explicitly acknowledged such feelings toward someone whose business she deplored. Then I'm staying too. Not in guest suite indefinitely, but nearby enough to be present in her daily life. She needs female influence in someone who isn't part of your world. I'll maintain my practice, but I'll be here for her. We'll figure out the logistics, but she needs consistency. That's non-negotiable. The pronouncement carried weight beyond its practical implications, establishing that Celeste was choosing to embed herself in his household not through obligation, but through genuine commitment to Keva's welfare. The veterinarian was voluntarily entering criminal territory she'd previously maintained careful distance from, crossing boundaries she'd established over years of professional interaction. The significance of that decision wasn't lost on either of them, though neither fully articulated what it meant for their relationship or their respective futures. 3 days later, Keva asked the question they'd been anticipating since she'd arrived. They were in the garden, Celeste reading while Keva played with Phantom in the afternoon sunshine that had replaced winter's biting cold with spring's gentle warmth. "How did my parents die?" she asked suddenly, the question emerging without preamble or warning, as if she'd been gathering courage to voice it, and couldn't wait for perfect moment that might never arrive. Celeste looked at Holden, who'd been working on his laptop nearby, silently asking how much truth was appropriate for 7-year-old ears. He set aside the computer and moved closer, recognizing that this conversation required his participation, rather than delegating difficult truths to Celeste. "There was a fire at the sanctuary," he began, choosing words carefully. "The building had electrical problems that caused the fire to spread very fast. Your parents got many animals out safely, but they went back inside for more animals even when it wasn't safe. The building collapsed before they could get back out." Keva absorbed this information with the same careful consideration she applied to all serious topics, her small face reflecting internal processing that suggested she was weighing what she'd been told against whatever memories and assumptions she'd carried. "They died saving animals," she said finally, voice steady despite the tears beginning to form. "That's what they would have wanted. They always said animals deserve protection same as people. They kept their promise even when it was hard." The echo of her earlier question to Holden, "Are you a good person?" resonated through her statement about her parents' final actions. They'd been good people who'd kept promises even when it cost everything, and now she was evaluating everyone against that standard. Holden felt the weight of that measurement, aware that his ability to honor commitments made to her would determine whether he deserved the trust she was extending. "They loved you very much," Celeste added gently, moving closer to provide physical comfort while maintaining space for Keva to process independently. "And they would be so proud of how brave you've been, how you survived and found Umbra just like your mama told you to. You kept your promise to her, and that matters more than you probably understand." The affirmation seemed to break something loose in Keva, and she cried with the abandon of someone finally safe enough to release emotions that survival had required her to suppress. Phantom pressed against her, offering his bulk as anchor, while she grieved with the intensity that 6 months of delayed mourning required. Holden watched this display feeling helpless in face of pain he couldn't fix through application of resources or tactical planning. But Celeste's hand found his, squeezing briefly in gesture that acknowledged his presence mattered even when he couldn't actively solve the problem. They stood together while Keva cried, providing the stable foundation she needed to fall apart safely, knowing someone would be there when she was ready to rebuild. That evening, after Keva had exhausted herself and fallen asleep with Phantom curled on the bed beside her, Holden and Celeste sat in his study discussing the guardianship hearing scheduled for the following week. The paperwork was complete, the narrative established, and the judge had been carefully selected for his willingness to accept convenient explanations over thorough investigation. It should be a straightforward process, but both of them felt anxiety about outcomes that couldn't be completely controlled. "She trusts you," Celeste observed, her tone carrying weight that transformed simple statement into something more significant. "Despite everything she's been through, despite the strangeness of this situation, she's decided you're worth trusting. That's a gift, and it's also a responsibility that goes beyond legal guardianship. You'll be the primary male figure in her life, the one she'll measure all other men against. The example you set now determines who she becomes. That's terrifying power to hold over someone's development." Holden understood the magnitude of what Celeste was articulating, having spent weeks grappling with implications that extended far beyond immediate crisis response. "I know, and I'm going to fail her sometimes because I don't know what I'm doing, and because my instincts are all wrong for this role. But I'm going to try, and I'm going to keep trying even when it's hard. That's all I can promise, that I'll show up and do my best, even when my best isn't good enough. That's actually more than most parents promise," Celeste said with a slight smile that softened her usual professional demeanor. "Most people have children assuming they'll figure it out as they go, that love will be sufficient guide through impossible decisions. At least you're going in with realistic assessment of your limitations. That self-awareness might be more valuable than natural parenting instincts." Her hand found his again, the touch lingering longer than brief reassurance, suggesting feelings she hadn't explicitly acknowledged but couldn't entirely hide. The guardianship hearing proceeded exactly as Holden's legal team had orchestrated. The judge accepted documentation without question, asked perfunctory questions that had been anticipated and rehearsed, and issued orders granting temporary custody with permanent placement to be reviewed in 6 months. It was anticlimactic in its efficiency, bureaucratic machinery processing life-altering decisions with the same casual precision applied to traffic violations. But the result was what mattered. Kiva was legally his responsibility, and Phantom came with her as part of package deal that couldn't be separated. They celebrated that evening with quiet dinner in the mansion's private dining room. Just Holden, Celeste, and Kiva with Phantom lying beneath the table accepting treats Kiva snuck to him when she thought the adults weren't watching. It felt like family in ways that made Holden uncomfortable and hopeful simultaneously. Domestic tableau that had no place in his criminal empire but existed anyway, through accumulated choices that had brought them to this improbable moment. "Thank you for keeping your promise," Kiva said, as Celeste was tucking her into bed later that night. The statement directed at Holden, who'd come upstairs to say goodnight. "Mama said good people keep their promises, and you did. That means you're a good person, right?" The question sought confirmation of conclusion she'd already reached. Validation from adult authority figure that her trust hadn't been misplaced. Holden felt his throat tighten with emotions he couldn't fully name, touched by faith extended despite all evidence that he didn't deserve such unconditional trust. "I'm trying to be," he said, echoing his earlier response but with more conviction born from weeks of follow-through. "And having you and Umbra here makes me want to try harder. So maybe you're making me better just by being here. Maybe that's enough." The admission was more honest than he'd intended, vulnerability slipping past defenses that criminal operations had required him to maintain. Kiva smiled then, bright genuine expression that transformed her face from haunted survivor into the child she should have been allowed to remain if circumstances had been different. "Mama always said animals know who's safe. Umbra knew you were safe even before I did. That's why he stayed with you instead of running away. Dogs are smarter about people than people are about people." The simple wisdom carried truth that Holden couldn't argue with, animal instinct proving more reliable than human rationalization. After Kiva slept, Holden and Celeste stood in the hallway outside her room, the quiet intimacy of the hour, and the accumulated weight of the weeks, creating space for conversation that had been developing beneath surface of their practical collaboration. "What happens now?" Celeste asked softly. "We've solved the immediate crisis, established legal framework, given her foundation for recovery. But long-term? How does this actually work with your business and her needs and everything we haven't figured out yet?" "I don't know," Holden admitted, the answer feeling more honest than any strategic plan he might have constructed. "But we'll figure it out together. You're part of this now, whether you intended to be or not. She needs you, and He paused, recognizing that finishing that sentence required acknowledging feelings he hadn't examined carefully enough to articulate properly. "I need you too, for her sake, but also because you make me want to be the person she thinks I am." That's valuable in ways I'm still processing. Celeste studied his face in the dim hallway lighting, searching for honesty beneath words that could be manipulation, if he'd remained the criminal operator she'd met years earlier. But something in his expression satisfied whatever criteria she was applying, and she nodded slowly. Then we'll figure it out together. But if this is going to work, you need to understand I'm not just hired help or temporary solution. If I'm staying, I'm actually staying, as part of her life, and by extension, part of yours. That comes with expectations about how you operate and what I'll accept. We clear? Crystal clear, Holden confirmed, recognizing that Celeste was claiming permanent space in his household and his life with same fierce protectiveness she'd shown toward Kiva from the beginning. The veterinarian was establishing boundaries and expectations that went beyond professional relationship, suggesting future he hadn't anticipated, but found himself hoping for despite all the complications it entailed. I can work with those terms. Actually, I think I prefer them to the alternative of you leaving once Kiva's recovered. She needs you. We both do. 6 months after that night in the hallway, the mansion had transformed from fortress into something resembling home. Kiva thrived under combined care of Holden and Celeste, attending private school where she excelled academically while maintaining healthy suspicion of easy friendships that trauma had taught her to question. Phantom remained her constant companion, the dog's presence reassuring both her and Holden that the connection that had brought them together remained strong, despite normalized routines that replaced initial crisis. Holden's business continued with same efficiency it always had, but his priorities had shifted in ways that his organization adapted to rather than resisted. Violence became last resort rather than preferred tool. Negotiations replaced confrontations where possible, and he'd begun systematically withdrawing from operations that posed greatest legal risk. The transformation wasn't sudden or complete, but the direction was clear. He was building toward legitimacy not because he feared consequences, but because Kiva deserved guardian who could attend school functions without risking arrest. Celeste had moved permanently into the mansion's west wing, maintaining her veterinary practice from newly constructed facility on the grounds while serving as Kiva's primary caregiver when Holden's business required his attention. Their relationship had evolved beyond professional collaboration into partnership that neither had explicitly defined, but both understood extended beyond Kiva's needs. They moved around each other with comfortable familiarity of people building shared life from accumulated daily choices that created foundations stronger than dramatic declarations. One evening, Holden found Kiva in the eastern courtyard where everything had begun, sitting with Phantom and talking to him in the quiet voice she used for conversations she thought were private. He approached silently, not wanting to interrupt, but curious about what she was saying to the dog who'd been her salvation, and her connection to parents she'd lost. "I told Mama I'd find you," Kiva was whispering, her small hand stroking Phantom's head with the gentle rhythm that had become ritual. "I kept my promise, and now we have a family again, even if it's different. I think she'd be okay with that. I think she'd like Holden and Celeste. They keep their promises too." Holden felt tears threatening for the first time in years, moved by casual acceptance of the family they'd built from impossible circumstances and accumulated choices that had led them all here. He'd entered this situation through accident and obligation, maintaining distance while managing crisis that fell into his lap without invitation. But somewhere along the way, distance had collapsed into genuine connection that transcended strategic benefit or calculated advantage. He'd become the person Kiva needed him to be, because she'd believed he could, before he'd believed it himself. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support matters and helps me continue bringing you stories like this one. Let me know what you thought about Holden, Kiva, Celeste, and Phantom's journey. I read every comment, and your engagement inspires me to keep creating content that hopefully moves you the way this story moved me while writing it.